wonderful story of love. Tell it to me again. Wonderful story of love. Wake the immortal strain. Angels with rapture announce it. Shepherds with wonder receive it. Sinner, oh, won't you believe it? Wonderful story of love. 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 Though you are.
All right, so to reveal and confirm primary purpose of the miracles, the only thing that I'll qualify that with is the statement that it was for the profit of everyone. Miracles were not for individual profit. Miracles were not so I could do something and people would go, ooh, isn't he impressive? Or maybe I should say nor, if I start with neither, are they for a specific individual to be able to be helped? If that makes any sense to you. They were for the benefit of everyone. And different gifts benefited people differently. One of the challenges we have today, we have our series on challenges in evangelism. One of the challenges that we have talked about in terms of teaching people in the greater community about God is that people doubt the veracity of what? Of the Bible. It wasn't any different then. There were people that doubted the veracity of the message. When Paul, for instance, spoke to the Greeks, there were those that would scoff at him because it seemed foolish to them, the things that he talked about. That was foreign to their mindset, to their way of thinking, to their belief system, to their philosophies, and they just thought he was fool. Not much different today. So the gift of prophecy in the first century, which was nothing more than revealing the message of God, speaking for God, to unbelievers could easily be scoffed at. Someone coming in and saying, this is the prophecy of God. Okay, if you say so. I don't believe in your God. But if someone came in speaking a message to you in your native tongue that they didn't know, you might do what? You might take a step back and say, maybe I ought to listen to this. There's something going on. That's exactly what happened in Acts 2, right? When all these people from all over the world had come to Jerusalem, I believe probably all of them, or at least most of them, could speak some measure of Hebrew. But that's not what happened. They didn't stand up and begin to expound the gospel to them in the Hebrew tongue. They began to speak to them in their native tongues. And in fact, the audience asked the question among themselves, according to the record, how is it that we hear them speaking in our own languages, though they're all Galileans? These were people from other places, Hellenistic Jews that had adopted the Greek languages and practices and customs of the places in which they were living. And they were just shocked that someone from Jerusalem, or from Israel, I should say, and uneducated men from Galilee were speaking to them in their own native tongues. Just like I would suspect that if I traveled to Brazil and got off an airplane and started walking around and conversing with someone freely in Portuguese, there would probably be people who are shocked. And then they would secondarily assume that I must have did what? Studied the language, but there's these uneducated men who are speaking their tongue, and they're like, how's this happening? So that is part of what tongues was able to accomplish, and it allowed the Great Commission to be carried out. You can't bring the gospel to all nations from a group of people who spoke one language. So how's that going to happen in the time period in which it did? By the way, before the New Testament was closed, there's an affirmation that it had gone forth into the whole world. How's that possible? Well, the way it's possible is through the gift of tongues. And because these things were done in a way that they were clearly supernatural, that gave credence to the message. People still had the choice of what? Whether or not they would believe. So it doesn't take that aspect of it away. That's the important thing to remember. The miracles were not for the purposes of making this believable. It's for the purposes of demonstrating that it was a legitimate message, and then people still had the choice as to whether or not they would hear and believe. And we see that exemplified throughout the book of Acts, where some people believed and some people didn't. They all heard and saw the same thing. They still had the power to make choices. And so the role is to accomplish this for the profit of everyone, believer and unbeliever alike, and everyone in the church. Look at 1 Corinthians 12 and verse 7. To each is given the manifestation of the Spirit for the, depends on which translation you're reading, whether it says for the profit of all, whether it says for the common good. Anybody reading from the King James? Not the 1611 one, the more recent than 1611. What about the New King James? What's the language that's used there? Is that what you're looking at today? You got the ESV with you. Chapter 12 of 1 Corinthians, verse 7, the end of the verse. For the profit of all, that's what the King James says? Oh, the New King James? Okay. So we've got profit, we've got for the common good, whatever the King James says is probably close to that. The point is pretty clear, that it's the common good. Well, what is the common good? To benefit all. In the framers of our national constitution and the ones that worked on developing this young nation, the way they would express that is for the general welfare. It's the same idea. Yes, sir.
When the dream she came down.
Yep.
It basically said, he said, and he said, and at the end of it, God told me, he said, we do not call anything I've been common. What did he mean by that if they're saying that?
All right, that's good. That's a good question. And here's the answer to that question. Under the Jewish law, there were clean animals, and the way common was used by the King James Version at that time were unclean animals. You had those that were clean and were allowable for them to eat, and you had those that were not allowed. They were common or mundane, not sanctified. His vision had all of these animals that were not clean animals, and he said, rise, Peter, kill and eat. Peter says, I've never eaten anything that was common or unclean. That's what that's referring to there. When we're talking about common in this context, it just simply means general, for all. By the way, it kind of meant that same thing even then, because what you had was the children of Israel who were sanctified, set apart from the rest of the world, and the law that was given specifically to them, that law didn't apply to everyone. The Gentile didn't have those dietary restrictions. The Gentile didn't honor the Sabbath. The Gentile didn't have any obligation to keep those things. So it was part of the sanctification, part of the setting apart of the nation of Israel from the rest of the world that created that. So the world was common and they were sanctified. But this is for the common good. This is for everyone. Yes. Absolutely.
10 years down the road, Peter still withdrew, made a fool out of himself. And, there were some things that had to slowly be incorporated. Paul circumcised them
Well, yeah,
to keep, to
right.
please the Jews, but that was during the transition period.
I think even a better, potentially for the class, a better illustration is the gospel was preached in Acts chapter 2, but it was preached only to the Jews at that point. Even at the scattering of the Jews in Acts chapter 7, it says they went everywhere preaching the word, but then it says preaching to the Jews only. Now, the commission was to bring the gospel to all nations. But that didn't start at the beginning. And in fact, he had told them that it would start in Jerusalem and then go throughout Judea and then Samaria and then to the uttermost parts of the world. It was not until Acts chapter 10 in Cornelius' house that it is first preached to the Gentile. And in order to make that happen, God had to intervene with this vision and convince Peter to go do it. And when Peter finished that night and he had those visions, actually 3 times this event happens, he says, I now know that God desires for this to go to the Gentile. And so he went and spoke to them without any hesitation. Then when he went back to Jerusalem, which is the next chapter in Acts, and he defends what took place, he explains to the saints in Jerusalem, this is what happened. And this is how I knew it. And then he says, the Spirit fell on them just as he did on us at the beginning. Who could deny them water to be baptized at that point? In other words, God testified that it was okay for the Gentiles to be acceptable. That took some time. And then it had to move from there. It didn't immediately get to everybody in the world. It took time. And so, yes, you got lots of stuff going on. You've got the struggle, part of what we'll talk about here in a minute. You've got the struggle with the Jews who have accepted Christ, but who also still have a hard time letting go of the traditions of Judaism that they've always practiced. And then so you see, even late in the chapters of the book of Acts, Paul's still going to Jerusalem to keep the feast. Was he obligated to keep the feast? No, but he still went to do it. And at one point, he pays a temple tax. He takes part in the, what it's not named there, the Nazarite vow. It's pretty clear that's the vow that he had taken. He took part in the vow. He took part in paying and offering the sacrifices connected with coming out of that vow. None of that was required under Christ, yet he still did those things with a clear conscience and without any problems. And by the way, I'll say, with God's sanction. And then Paul gets used more than anybody to teach folks, hey, don't let this create problems for your faith. And we'll look at that as we move on to answer the question of how long the gifts will last. I think, no, maybe it's no, I tell you what, it's not. It's in the bulletin article this morning. That's where I spent all my time studying that out this week. So read the bulletin this morning, and you'll get that discussion. Anyway, the prophet of all very clearly stated there. Look at chapter 14, verses 3 and 4. Well, let's go verse 2. For one who speaks in a tongue speaks not to men, to God. No one understands him, but he utters mysteries in the Spirit. And this is talking about within the confines of the church there at Corinth, where they all spoke the same language. Somebody come in there and speak in one of the barbarian tongues from Northern Europe, nobody would understand him. What good would that do? Who would be edified by that? And he says, no one. On the other hand, the one who prophesies speaks to people for their upbuilding and encouragement and consolation. So prophecy was for the benefit of people to hear and understand and have their faith built as a result. Well, look down in verse, 22 maybe? Yeah. And let's back up to verse 21. In the law it is written, by people of strange tongues and by the lips of foreigners will I speak to this people, and even then they will not listen to me, says the Lord. Thus tongues are a sign not for believers but for unbelievers, while prophecy is a sign not for unbelievers but for believers. And that's what I was talking about at the very end of the introduction of the first part of our new material class this morning, is that these gifts had specific roles. And what he argues through these 3 chapters to the church at Corinth is, hey guys, that's great that you speak in tongues. I speak in tongues too. That's wonderful and fabulous. But if there's not someone there to interpret it so that the people in the assembly can understand what you're saying, sit down and be quiet. Because tongues aren't to show off how great you are. Tongues are to teach. And if that's not what's happening, keep your mouth shut. The same thing he said about prophecy. He said to use it constructively, to limit. Just because you could prophesy didn't mean you should. And so in this assembly, he says, limit it to 2 or 3. And then he says, speak one at a time, so that everyone can be edified. If you had 2 or 3 people standing up here with me, and we were all saying different things, what would you understand? It'd be very tantamount to modern music. It'd be noise. And that's what he calls it in this context. It's a clanging cymbal. Indistinguishable. You can't distinguish one thing from another. Cage's stuff, for instance. Anyway, that's what the purpose of these things are. If people can't be edified, they weren't to be used. And also we have this cautionary tale through 1 Corinthians that reminded them on more than one occasion. Listen, the spirits of the prophets are subject to the prophets. You're still in control. Even though you have this gift, you are still. In fact, we find out that Timothy was so hesitant to use his, Paul actually had to write to him and say, hey, I laid hands on you and gave you this gift for a reason. Use it for the reason I gave it to you. Don't neglect it. That's how controlled it was. Timothy wasn't using it apparently at all, even though he had it. Which I guess you could say that's an indication that Timothy was an humble man and he wasn't seeking glory for himself. Because what the problem was at Corinth is they were overusing them to try to show that they were better and more important than one another. Both of those extremes, though, fail to accomplish the purpose that they're giving, because they're given to reveal, to confirm, to the benefit of all, so that everyone could know the Word of God and know that it was the Word of God. All right. How long? How long, therefore, are they needed? That's my version of the question. How long are the gifts to last, the way that you hear people talk about it? Look with me at chapter 13 of 1 Corinthians, because this is where we're going to focus in on this. If we read 1 Corinthians 13, I think it's really hard to not acknowledge that they have a limited duration. And we won't read the whole chapter. This is the chapter on love that we're so familiar with. There's a section of this that almost always gets used in weddings. This actually doesn't have anything to do with weddings, but doesn't matter. It does describe love, probably better than any other single passage. As it gets to the end of that discussion, look with me at verse 8. Love never ends. All right, so how long will we experience and engage as human beings with love? Forever. What about after we die? Love is still there. What about after the world comes to an end? Love is still there. No matter where we are, no matter what we're doing, no matter what the circumstances, we have love. As for prophecies, they will pass away. Now, in this context, he's not talking about the prophecy itself, although that once something is fulfilled, then the prophecy doesn't really have need anymore. But he's talking about the individual who can give prophecy. That's going to cease. Tongues, this ability to communicate to people that speak foreign languages that you've never studied. Tongues, they will cease. Knowledge, not all knowledge, but this supernatural knowledge that he talks about and lists at the beginning of this discussion as one of the gifts of the Spirit, and that's what this is a short encapsulated list to represent the longer list at the beginning of this section and represents all of those gifts. Knowledge, it will pass away. We know in part and we prophesy in part, but when the perfect comes, the partial will pass away. We know that these gifts are going to cease. It's very clear. Therefore, the only question that remains is when. What is this describing? And particularly in this context, it tells us when the perfect comes. Okay, what's the perfect? And that is where people start diverging. And that leads people to different conclusions about whether or not gifts still happen today. So, let's talk about that for a moment. What is the contrast that's going on here? Well, before I do that, let me, I guess, be fair and talk about some of the things that people believe that the perfect coming is referring to. Some folks out there say that's talking about the second return of Christ, that he's the perfect one, and so these things are going to last until his return. Some say that it's talking about heaven, that heaven is perfect, that when we're in heaven, these things will cease. By the way, I'm not sure that you can differentiate too much between those two events. They pretty much going to happen about the same time. Notwithstanding, there are people that think there's 1,000 years that are going to separate them, but that's another issue for another class. The contrast, though, what is the contrast in this context between partial knowledge and perfect knowledge? That's the contrast. Context always defines what you're talking about. And if an interpretation ignores the context, it's probably not a good interpretation. This is not talking about the contrast between when Christ is not present with us and when Christ is present with us. This is not talking about the contrast between when the church is on the earth and when the church has been received into heaven. The contrast is when we know and when we fully know. when we know in part, and while we're yet waiting for the revelation to come to all. Perfect is a word that means brought to its end, finished, wanting nothing. Perfect. Perfect does not mean flawless. When you perfect something, it just simply means you finish it. Now, if you're like me, flawless is the standard that you want to set for yourself, which makes it very hard for me to finish anything because I never can quite seem to get it to perfect, and then I'm frustrated and just quit. But perfect simply means that you finish it. You can perfect a document. The way you perfect a document is you complete it. You can, that is literally all that it means. So you got this contrast between partial knowledge and complete knowledge. Between when it's being revealed in parts, for we prophesy in part, we know in part, and when it is completed. When you get what Paul revealed and what Peter revealed and what Jude revealed and what Mark revealed and you got it all, and all the revelation is there, keeping in mind that the primary purpose of these is to do what? To reveal and confirm. Once that happens, here's the question I have. What do you need them for anymore? It's already been revealed. It's already been confirmed. That's what they're for. And what is he arguing here? Well, when it's complete, then these things will pass away. Now, was it immediate? I don't know. I don't know if, and we can debate on what was the final book that was written. I personally believe it was Jude, but that's just my belief. I don't know if when he put the last period and stuck it in the mailbox to go out to the people that he sent it to, whether they just all stopped immediately, I don't know. Or if people continued to be able to do these things until they passed away. But this is what I can guarantee it. Just reason tells me this. If the only way for any of us to have a gift is for the apostles to directly lay their hands on us and impart that gift to us by granting of God, they're all gone. I don't see how anybody could have a gift today. Now, that's just logic. But then you take what is said here and we get a picture of what they're for and the fact that once that has happened, then that they would pass away. And you add time to that, and I think that explains why none of us have seen anyone who miraculously received their sight, who miraculously received the ability to walk, who was raised from the dead. None of us have seen these things. And I also think that that's probably why the only thing that anybody claims to be able to do along these lines today, well, with the exception of the people who handle snakes, is speak in tongues. That's all they claim they can do. And then what's really fun is a lot of them that do that, when you call them on it, they tell you they have no idea what they said, that it's a secret language, and only God knows. Which flies in the face of everything that he says in 1 Corinthians about the purpose of tongues. So I have a problem with that view and what we've just read. Yes, sir.
I do believe what maid servant brought in her son, and her son wasn't, he couldn't see, but he could feel, and her son was the right son, and he passed his gift on.
Yep.
So I was asking, during that generation, with the apostles and everything, and laying their hands on everyone, like you said, passing down this blessing from generation to generation. That's why I've seen the blessing passed down, so there's no actual, who was the last person to lay hands? and their generation of generality.
Right. But what Acts 8 makes very clear pertaining to the gifts of the Spirit is, it says that when Simon saw that the gifts were given by the laying on of the apostles' hands, then you've got a source, the apostles. The apostles are dead and gone. There are no apostles to lay hands on anyone today. So if that's the way that they were done, and that's what this text says, and that's what it goes on to show throughout the remainder of the book of Acts, that that's how it happened. When Paul went into Ephesus after Apollos apparently preached to the folks of Ephesians, he went into Ephesus, he asked them about whether they'd received the Spirit in gifts, and they said, we don't even know that there is a Spirit. Well, then into what were you baptized? Well, we were baptized into John's baptism. Well, then he says, well, I need to preach to you some things that you don't know. You've got an incomplete knowledge. But the reason he asked that question was because they didn't have the gifts. And so he was going to apparently impart to some of them the gifts that were needed, but they weren't even yet ready for that, he learns. And so he has to do some more teaching. That is the only way it was ever done once the Cornelius chapter closes. So if there's no, and then again, you add to that the layer of the fact that the purpose of the gifts was to confirm the message. If the message is finished, if we do have all of the message, then we've got no more purpose for the gift. It's already confirmed, it's given to us. And we're going to keep developing that idea to some further degree, although we don't have a lot of time left this morning. I want to get far enough that I don't lose my special notes, which are different than my notes that are pre-prepared. Where does faith come from? Hearing the word of God, Romans 10:17. So when you get to this discussion, right here back where we're at, 1 Corinthians chapter 13, after he says, as for prophecies, they'll pass away. As for tongues, they'll cease. And knowledge, it will pass away. We know in part, we prophesy in part, but when the perfect comes, the partial will pass away. He gives us a couple of illustrations. When I was a child, I spoke like a child. I thought like a child. I reasoned like a child. When I became a man, I gave up childish ways. There's illustration number one. Maturity, natural maturity that all of us experience and know. And we know that some things are childish, that are uninformed. Now, by the way, I want to make something very clear. I believe that all people are born with the intelligence that they have. I don't think our intelligence changes. I think the difference between a child and an adult is knowledge and experience. That is what changes, is we have knowledge. And with that knowledge, we make better choices with the capacity that we've been given. When I give up childish things, it's because I've learned better. And that's exactly what we say to our children too, isn't it? You know better than that. That's okay.
Like you said, you can't predict adult IQ and child IQ.
I agree.
Because IQ does change over time.
Right.
But at a certain age, like 20, probably 30, it maximizes.
And then it starts dropping the other direction. And this is what I'll say about that. IQ is a measurement of an intelligence, not the intelligence itself. That's an important distinction. The reason I would argue that it's below its peak at that stage is because they are not yet able to express their intelligence. At that peak is when both of those things meet. When my ability to communicate and know is at its peak, my ability to express that through the test is also at its peak. Right. Exactly. There's some skills, absolutely, which is part of knowledge. That's all part of learning. So I don't know that we're all that far apart in that. For those of y'all that don't know, that's his business. So yeah, you never retire. But anyway, so he then says, illustration number 2, here's some biblical proof that you could have more than one illustration for the same point. Now we see in a mirror dimly, but then face to face. Is there something different between seeing a reflection of something and actually seeing something? Yes. Is there a difference between seeing a photograph of the Grand Canyon and seeing the Grand Canyon? For those of us who have never seen the Grand Canyon, we would go, I don't really know. But I promise, when you're standing there, you go, wow, photos don't do this justice. When we had partial knowledge, it was going to be a different view than when we have full knowledge. So listen to what he goes on to say. Now I know in part, then I shall know fully, even if I have been fully known. So now, faith, hope, and love abide. But the greatest of these is love. Usually when I teach on this, I talk about faith and love a lot, and I just kind of glossed over hope. In this context, hope is the most important part of the discussion. Because what do we know about hope? Romans 8, 24 and 25 says that you do not hope for what is seen. You hope for what is not seen. So what do we hope for as Christians? We hope for the return of Christ. We hope for the resurrection from the dead. We hope for heaven. If that which is perfect is talking about the return of Christ, the resurrection, and us being brought to heaven, then hope doesn't remain. So the time period that he is talking about is a time period that still includes us hoping for things not yet seen. It can't be the second coming of Christ and the things that are realized at that point if hope remains. Faith is going to remain and love is going to remain, but when those things come to pass, hope is gone because we're going to see. So I'm absolutely convinced from this context that since how faith, hope, and love all remain after the period of time and when these gifts were practiced came to an end, we're in the middle of that time. The message has been confirmed. The message has all been delivered. Jude wrote about it, said it was once for all delivered. By the way, that runs exactly in line with what Paul teaches about the gifts, that they were for the common good. It was once for all delivered. We have it confirmed, and I'll turn your attention, we're out of time, very quickly to John chapter 20, and I'm going to have to summarize. I was going to read all verses 24 through 31. I'll have to summarize up to verses 30 and 31, which is that exchange with Thomas. You'll remember that Thomas was the last of the disciples to accept that Jesus was resurrected, and until he touched his body and put his hands in his wounds, he just wouldn't believe it. And they have that exchange. And after that happens, this is what John writes. Now Jesus did many other signs in the presence of the disciples, which are not written in this book, but these are written so that you may believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and that believing you may have life in his name. The book is what is left. What is written is what is left. The process of the revealing has been perfected and completed. That's done. The book is left, and by reading this, we can have faith, hope, and love. And that's what remains. So my answer to the question, based upon my study of the Word of God as to when these things would cease, is that when their purpose ceased, when the message was delivered, when we had all of the revelation that we now can test people against. And we know what we should believe and what we should not believe. Or we can know what we should believe and what we should not believe. We don't all know that, but we can know it. Then the purpose of those things ceases to exist. They pass away, but what remains is what this book can generate, which is faith, hope, and love.
long as necessary.
Yes. Which is true about everything, especially those things pertaining to God. They lasted as long as they were necessary. When Jesus fulfilled the law of Moses, what happened to the law of Moses? It faded away. It was of no consequence anymore. When he ascended back up into heaven, he was not here anymore. And in fact, he explained to them that it was to their advantage that he did leave, because there was things coming after his presence on the earth that were yet needed. And so that's the best way to understand it. Got to stop. I'm already way past time. But couldn't stop until I finished what we needed to say. That's right.
Wonderful story of love, tell it to me again. Wonderful story of love, with the immortal strain. Angels with rapture announce it, shepherds with wonder receive it. Sinner, oh, won't you believe it? Wonderful story of love.